I am a Methodist preacher. I was a pastor in Mississippi for about 5 years, and so I can't help but tell this story as I take my watch off. This is one of my favorite preacher stories. There was a little boy, or I guess it could have been a girl, either one, who came to church one time with a grandparent and was just taking it all in, and every little action that was taken wanted to know, what does that mean? And so the grandfather would say, oh, well, this means such and so, and you know, 2 or 3 things like that. And then as the minister got up to preach, the grandchild noticed that the minister took his watch off and laid it on the pulpit. And so the little child asked the grandfather, what does that mean? And the grandfather said, not a damn thing. But I will try to help it mean something anyway, when Dale called me to ask me to do this, she said roughly 20 minutes. I've got lots that I can say about this topic, and so I'll jump in and try to finish in 20 or maybe 1 or 2 minutes past, because I know you all will have some things to ask, and I could talk about this all morning, but we don't want to stay here all morning, I imagine. So, and you may have seen out on the board, the topic is struggling with the past, and I thought, for a couple of reasons. One, since we're celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday tomorrow. I think the actual birthday was yesterday, if I recall. And because I am doing some fairly long-term research on the ways in which the white Methodist Church in Mississippi responded to the Civil Rights Movement in the early 1960s. And finally, because there's been the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement and what happened in those days has been in the news quite a bit recently, I thought that all of those things kind of converged to make it appropriate for me to talk a bit about struggling with the past. As most of you probably know, a couple of weeks ago, a grand jury in Neshoba County, Mississippi, which is in East Mississippi, handed down an indictment for murder against Edgar Ray Killen, who was one of the conspirators. I don't think he was actually there at the death, but he was one of the conspirators in the murders of Mickey Schwerner, Andy Goodman, and James Chaney in June of 1964 in Neshoba County. And let me just very briefly remind you of the story. It's what John Dittmer, who is a historian of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, calls very aptly the most depressingly familiar story of the Mississippi movement. In June of 1964, at the beginning of Freedom Summer, which was the brainchild of some of the leaders of the movement in Mississippi to try to get a whole bunch of folks from all over the country into Mississippi to call attention to what was going on there. Mickey Schwerner, who he and his wife had lived in Meridian, where my wife grew up, about 40 miles south of Philadelphia. They had been there for a while, and he had been up to Neshoba County a good bit in the previous months and had convinced the leaders of Mount Zion Methodist Church, which was an African-American, still is an African-American congregation in Neshoba County, to allow the folks in the movement to use their school at their church as one of the freedom schools that they wanted to use that summer. And on about the 16th of June, the Klan came, a bunch of Klansmen came, beat up a couple of the members of the church and burned the church to the ground. And at the time, Mickey Schwerner was in Oxford, Ohio at the training event for the Freedom Summer Volunteers. So when he returned to Mississippi on Saturday, June the 20th, the next morning, or maybe early the next afternoon, he got in his car along with James Chaney, who was an African-American from Meridian, had been involved in the movement for about the past year, and he and Schwerner were very good friends. And Andy Goodman, who was a summer volunteer and had arrived in Mississippi on that Saturday, so this was his first full day in Mississippi, went up to Neshoba County to see the church and to talk to the folks there. After they left, they were driving through Philadelphia, were pulled over by a sheriff's deputy, Cecil Price, who, I don't even remember what the trumped-up charges were, but took them to the jail. They sat there for about, 7 hours and were released about 10:30 that night. And as they were driving to leave Neshoba County, were chased, pulled over and stopped again, and later that night were killed. And their bodies were buried in an earthen dam in western Neshoba County. There was a long search for their bodies. They were finally found in August, and I think you may know that no one has ever been, until 2 weeks ago, no one has ever been charged formally by the state of Mississippi with their murder. If you know anything about those days, you know that one of the reasons for that is they wouldn't have gotten a conviction, most likely. 7 of the 18 or so folks who were involved in the conspiracy were convicted in a federal trial of violating Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner's civil rights, which I've always found a little bit of an understatement, and served some time in prison. Edgar Ray Killen, who was indicted a couple of weeks ago, was one of the ones tried in that trial, but he was not convicted. And unfortunately, several of the folks who were involved, including the ones that killed the 3 of them, are now deceased. But Killen is still alive, and he has been arrested, and there will be a trial. He claims that he's innocent. One news story I saw quoted his wife as saying she, of course, was going to stand behind him. And one of the things that it occurred to me as I've been reading those articles in the paper is that, you kind of look back on that and you think, how in the world can someone who, and we know, that there's really no doubt that he was involved in this, in this plot, and yet he maintains that he's innocent. And you kind of wonder, how in the world can someone can tell that sort of lie? And there'd be all sorts of reasons, I suppose, to protect themselves or whatever. But one of the things that occurred to me as I was reading some of those news articles the other day is that it's almost as if somehow in his mind, perhaps his wife's mind, perhaps members of his family and perhaps his friends in their mind, it's almost as if they can think in some way that whether or not he was actually involved in that murder, that plot 40 years ago, that he is now no longer the same person. And so, therefore, he's not guilty in some way. Perhaps that's the way they're thinking. And believe me, Mississippi is a very different world from the way it was 40 years ago. I am a Mississippian. I call myself a Mississippi exile because I haven't lived there in about 20 years. My wife and I are both Mississippi exiles. But I think this is one of the ways that people deal with the past, is that in their mind they decide that, well, that was another time, another place, I was a different person, and so therefore I'm innocent. My mother has one brother, and his wife, my aunt, is a psychologist in the D.C. area. She grew up in Meridian, Mississippi as well, same place my wife did. She's older than my wife. And in fact, when she was in high school, she knew Alton Wayne Roberts, who killed both Schwerner and Goodman. He was the person who actually pulled the trigger, and he is now deceased. He was one of the 7 that did serve some jail time for the civil rights violation charge. About 10 years ago, my aunt was wanting to do a book on the psychology of violence. And she wrote Alton Wayne Roberts a letter, because as I said, she did know him fairly well in high school, told him that she was doing this, and wanted to know if he would be willing to be one of her subjects. In other words, if he would be willing for her to interview him at some length to try to understand some of the psychology of violence. And he wrote back and refused. And one of the things that he said was, "You seem to think of me as a violent person, and I don't see myself that way at all." Again, this sort of disconnect from the past, that somehow, because that was a different world and a different time, I'm not that person anymore. Now, I think that one of the ways that we can at least begin to understand how such terrible evil could have happened so easily in a place like Mississippi is to think about and try to understand the culture of 1950s and 1960s Mississippi a little better. That's a very complex subject, but I'll say one or two things about it. James Silver, who was a history professor at the University of Mississippi in the 50s and 60s, wrote a book which came out in 1963 called The Closed Society. And that was the phrase that he coined to describe what Mississippi was like. Another way to think about that is that the segregated system had such a hold on not only life in Mississippi, but on the minds of everyone, particularly white folks in Mississippi, that people were willing, including people who called themselves Christians, and most people in Mississippi at the time did, were willing to make, they didn't, I think, realize this is what they were doing, were willing to make that culture and that system an idol. It was the thing that had to go on. It was life as they knew it, and they did not want it to change. And I think that's the way that, that's one of the ways to understand how this sort of thing could happen. There's all sorts of other things to say. For instance, one of the ways in which this system was kind of kept in place after the Brown versus Board of Education decision was handed down in 1954, the White Citizens Council was started in Indianola, Mississippi, which is in the Delta, spread all over the state, all over the South, as a matter of fact. And most folks who talk about the history of those days, and folks back then who were involved in the movement, called the White Citizens Council the Uptown Klan. In other words, they were the business leaders, and there were church leaders as well involved in this, who didn't resort to direct physical violence, but did everything they could to keep everybody in line so that the system would stay the way it was. If anybody dared to try to register to vote, try to organize, blacks I mean, to try to organize some sort of resistance or movement for change in particular small towns in Mississippi, the White Citizens Council got into action very quickly, made sure that they lost their jobs, that they were squeezed in all sorts of other ways. It was a very powerful system. And there's lots more that I can say about that. But I want to read you something from a book that I came across last year that I think may help us to come to something of an understanding about how a state in which so many people thought of themselves as Christians, how those Christians could fail to see the problem with this system that they lived in. I'm not saying this to excuse them. Please don't misinterpret me. But I'm trying to help us understand perhaps a little better. This is a statement from the preface of a book called I Don't Care What the Bible Says. And in a minute you'll understand the title. The title of this, and this is from the preface, the title of this work, the author's name is Kenneth Coffin, by the way. The title of this work needs an explanation, especially since it was written by a theologian. I was a pastor of a Baptist church in Georgia when the Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation in the public schools was announced in May of 1954. Eventually, I got into trouble over the stand I took. In particular, some members were incensed over some letters I wrote to the Atlanta newspapers, along with a sermon I preached. The chairman of the board of deacons came to tell me that an effort was underway to have me removed from my office as pastor. He had refused to meet with the deacons to consider the issue unless I was present. He had come to invite me to the meeting. We engaged in a lengthy discussion during which I appealed to the Scriptures as the basis for my judgments about race. In anger, he said, "I don't care what the Bible says. We are not going to permit the integration of the races in our schools." This was a good and decent man, thoughtful, kind, and generous. He was also a Christian with a deep faith in God. In that little community full of wonderful people, he was one of my favorites. He was like hundreds of men and women I had come to know, and in many ways he was a typical white Southerner. He was one of the common whites, like my own family of farmers and mill workers, who will be the focus of my investigation. That this good man, whose own faith was anchored in the authority of the Bible, could make this remark to me, even in anger, embodies elements of every one of the categories I wish to use in interpreting the evil side of history. Hence, it is an appropriate title for an exploration of injustice, the tragic, the demonic, and the ambiguous in the land of cotton, honeysuckle, kudzu, and pine trees. And all four of those plants are certainly in much abundance in Mississippi as well as Georgia, even though he's talking about Georgia. Now, part of the reason, and this kind of gives me a transition to tell you just a little bit in a couple of minutes about the research that I'm doing. About a year and a half before Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were murdered in Neshoba County, I guess almost 2 years before, you probably remember that James Meredith integrated the University of Mississippi. And on that Sunday in late September 1962, when after all of the court battles and all the rigmarole surrounding it, when he finally arrived on the campus and was registered the next morning as a student there was a riot that night, and 2 people were killed. There was all kinds of violence. And what it signified, I think, to every single person in Mississippi who understood themselves to be a racial moderate, not a bigot, etc. What it signified to them was the realization that something had gone horribly wrong in the state of Mississippi, and that they needed to, if they could, and many of them were afraid to do so and did not, but they needed to stand up and say something about it in response. Now, I was 9 years old. Well, let's see. In 1962, I was 8 years old. We had moved to Mississippi in 1960. My father taught religion at Millsaps College for a little over 30 years. And my parents were behind-the-scenes supporters of the Jackson Civil Rights Movement. And I was always a kid with a fairly vivid imagination. I took a lot of stuff in. My father watched Huntley Brinkley religiously every night on NBC News, and I usually would watch it with him and saw all kinds of things related to the civil rights movement on the TV, plus was aware at least a bit of what was going on in Jackson. And as I said, I had a vivid imagination. And one of the things that, one of the kind of fantasies that I had in my mind was this news report about the race situation in Mississippi, in which the anchor man, I'm sure then, would end up by saying, but perhaps it was a young boy in Mississippi who put it the best, and then would have me on camera saying something. It was something fairly insipid, like I don't remember, something like, well, you know, the white folks, white people shouldn't blame blacks for all this. I mean, after all, they were the ones that brought blacks here in the first place, you know, in slavery. I mean, it was fairly simplistic, but and I think thinking back on that over the years, what I have realized is that was my way of expressing my belief that somehow one could make injustice right with your words. Think about the prophetic tradition, for instance, in the Old Testament. Well, there were some Methodist ministers in the early 1960s in Mississippi who I think had something of the same belief. And after the riot at Ole Miss, about 5 of them got together and put together a statement. It came to be called the Born of Conviction Statement. And looking back on it now, it's not really a very radical statement. It's fairly tame. The statement basically called for 4 things. It called for freedom of the pulpit, because one of the things the Citizens Council was very adept at was communicating very clearly to any minister in any town in Mississippi who dared to question the system that they could deal with him fairly easily. Freedom of the pulpit just basically reminded the Methodists in Mississippi of what the Methodist discipline already said, which was that certainly in the teachings of Jesus there was no discrimination by race, that all people were brothers and sisters in Christ, no matter what the color of their skin. It expressed support for the public schools, because there was all kinds of talk about closing the public schools. If the feds were going to force us to integrate, then we'd just close them down. And, that happened actually in Virginia in the late 1950s for at least a short time. And finally, the statement said, we're not communists. Because as you know, back then, if you dared to question the system at all, you were called a communist. Now, that statement doesn't sound very radical, but when it was published in the Methodist Conference newspaper on January 2nd, 1963, it caused a firestorm of controversy among Methodists in the state, and in fact among people in the state, because of course the newspapers picked it up almost immediately. The Jackson paper was about as strong a supporter of segregation as you could imagine a newspaper to be during those days. And so these ministers, it actually ended up 28 ministers signed it. And so what my research involves is I have gone around. There are 20 of the 28 ministers who are still living. About 2/3 of them left the state of Mississippi within a year or so after the statement came out because of the response to it, because of the persecution that some of them suffered, etc. And I have written, so they're all over the country. 20 of the 28 are still living. And I have interviewed almost all of them now. I've talked to family members. I've talked to family members of some of the ones that are deceased. And my plan is to write a book. Right now, my tentative title is Prophets and Priests in Their Own Country, Mississippi Methodists and the 1963 Born of Conviction Statement. I'm going to do a Lyceum lecture at Emory Henry on Thursday night, February 3rd, about this, and so if you're interested in hearing more about it, I'll invite you to come then. But the reason I bring that into this is that in the interviews that I did this summer, I talked at length with one of the 3 ministers who signed the statement, who were basically kicked out of their churches before they even were able to preach another sermon after that statement came out. And this one particular minister served a charge of 4 Methodist churches in rural Neshoba County. This was about a year and a half before Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were murdered. But as he was talking about this, one of the things he told me was his churches had a meeting. They weren't even going to tell him about it. There were 3 women in one of the churches who came by and told him about it because they thought that was only right, that he know that this was happening. And at the meeting, a member of one of his churches was Lawrence Rainey, who was the sheriff of Neshoba County and was pretty likely involved in the Cheney, Goodman, Schwerner plot. He was tried in that civil rights trial but was acquitted. And Lawrence Rainey made some sort of comment along the lines of, well, we know what to do with niggers who don't stay in line here in Mississippi. So what this minister told me was that it didn't surprise him at all that when this stuff happened about a year and a half later. Now, that brings me back to Edgar Ray Killen, and I want to say a couple of things about it, and then I'll be done. The first is that there have been several comments in news stories about Killen's arrest in which this view, and I'll just sort of sum it up in a few words, this view is expressed. Something along the lines of, arresting him now, 40 years later, when he's an old man, is a bad thing for Mississippi because all it's doing is stirring up old stuff, opening up old wounds, and that's not good. It's going to cause division between people, etc., etc. And while a minister that I interviewed this summer, whose brother was one of the signers of the Born of Conviction statement, and this meant this minister stayed in Mississippi. His brother left, but he stayed. He did not sign it. One of the things he said to me at the end of the interview was, and he had told me several stories about how he had struggled with his congregations in the mid-'60s, to try to come to some kind of understanding and acceptance of the changes that were going on. But he said toward the end of the interview, part of me is really sorry that you're going back and stirring this stuff up, because part of me wants it to stay quiet. But I also realize that the only way for real justice to be done and for real peace to come about the past is to deal with this. Justice has never been done in the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. And even if Killen is convicted, it won't really be done because a lot of the folks that were involved are not going to be charged, because many of them are dead, etc. But I think I'm a firm believer that when you struggle with the past, even the past of 40 years ago, that part of what you have to do is to come to the truth, to allow it to come out in order to find justice and move towards some sort of forgiveness and reconciliation. You may or may not be aware that part of the reason why these charges have now been brought is because a few years ago, a coalition of African American, Choctaw Indian, and white folks in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and in Neshoba County formed a coalition called the Philadelphia Coalition because they believed that it was time for Neshoba County to own up to its past and to work towards reconciliation. And it was partially because of their efforts, and this was a truly interracial group. There is a Choctaw Indian reservation just west of town in Philadelphia, and that's been a part of the race relations history of that place as well. And it was because of their efforts that this is happening. They had a 40th anniversary commemoration back in June of this past year. And the folks that I know who were there say that it was a very healing kind of experience, and that they believe that perhaps some steps toward reconciliation and owning up to the past were achieved through that. I think one of the examples that perhaps they're drawing on, at least a little bit, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And we don't have time to talk about that, but I don't know about you, but in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, I didn't see how South Africa was going to be able to change without wholesale violence, and yet they succeeded in doing it. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was set up, in which perpetrators of past crimes had to own up to what they did and to face their accusers. I think that comes pretty close to my understanding of what the Christian faith calls for for justice and reconciliation when injustice and evil and wrong has been done, even 40 years or more in the past.